Hello and welcome back to another video, and we are looking at the HP T510 thin client. This is a unique one. This is where things start to get interesting. It's not an Intel, it's not an AMD. What is it? We'll talk about that. So we'll just look at the outside and take a look at the specs. So it's a pretty solid and hefty box. It's in no way small, light, thin. It's it's pretty hefty. It's got two DVI ports at the back, one serial port, one parallel port, your keyboard and mouse PS2 ports, gigabit Ethernet, dual USB 2 ports. Nothing on here, but there's a hidden port somewhere. And then on the front you have mic, headphone, your USB ports, USB 2 again, and a power port, a power button. It takes standard 19 volts from the barrel jack, and that's about it. Simple hardware on the face of it, and nothing too complicated. The interesting bits start on the inside. So I have, as usual, the Parky Towers page open up. So on the Parky Towers website, you can see the processor is a VIA Eden X2 U4200, and this is an x86 64-bit CPU licensed from Intel or AMD, whoever holds the 64-bit license currently. And it's made under license, so it executes all your x86 64-bit instruction sets, so you can run Windows, play games, do all of that, and we will take a look. Um, but at the same time, it's not an Intel or AMD CPU. These were meant to replace Intel Atoms and the like, um, and they were okay. They don't really exist anymore. You can still buy some of them. I probably VIA is spitting out more variations, but they are um, mostly a thing of the past. And it has its own GPU. So VIA had the Chrome HD series. This has Chrome HD 2.0. Eh, it displays things as far as GPUs goes. Doesn't really work on Linux. There were some attempts to make it work on Linux, and half of it was politics and half of it was not politics, and it just died off. um, yeah, apart from that, there's nothing more specific. So the only interesting part is the VIA CPU itself, and that works fine. So we'll take a look at the performance, we'll take a look at few numbers, we'll run Windows on it, and we'll run Linux on it, and we'll see where things stand. So without further ado, let's take this thing apart and see what's inside. So just one screw, and this should slide off. Now once this slides off, there's a surprise hidden, which is you get two extra USB 2 ports right down there. And these are standard USB 2s, but you can like add a Wi-Fi card or something more permanent, more like a boot USB drive or something like that, or two boot USB drives in RAID. And no, just nice way to sort of keep it hidden and out of sight. Opening that up reveals a metal cover, so that acts as heat sink, uh, because it doesn't have any active cooling. This is all there is. So let's open that up. And take it apart. So underneath we have a big chunk of dirty thermal pad, and that's the main heat sink underneath. So this just used to dissipate things. Heat would be one thing that dissipates, but yeah. um, so this is your main heat spreader. Again, we will open it. Apart and underneath there, you can see there's a SATA header, and I say it's a header because you can basically take this out as a module. And again, this is just an SSD that's tagged onto it. So this is the inside of an SSD. That's a 90-degree SATA connector that I bought off of some website, and you can just pair these together and just slit slots under there, and it's fine. It's fine. It's meant for a DOM port, and then you have what seems like is it a mini PCIe or is it MSATA? I hope it's MSATA. I have a few MSATA drives. That is a mini PCIe slot. So I haven't played around with that slot a whole lot, um, but that would be useful for Wi-Fi and things like that. I don't know if it would like support external GPUs. That would be a nice experiment at some point. Again, we'll look at in detail when I take everything else apart. That's your IDE DOM. So like a CF card, or I think a CF card should just slot in. There shouldn't be any issues with a CF card just slotting in on top. That would be interesting to find out. No, no, it would still require that conversion board, but because CF card isn't 40 pin ID compatible, is it? No. So it'll still require, so but it's useful for a ID DOM. You can just slot those in. And then you have your DDR3 memory. Yep, it's 4 GB DDR3. I thought I had an 8 GB module in there, but I do not. So that is a 4 GB DDR3 memory, and that should work just fine. The website, the Parky Tower website, is a bit inconsistent on what actual max memory capacity, because a lot of time these things would be designed keeping just say 2 GB of memory in mind, and the BIOS will show more. Sometimes it allocates them correctly, but some operating systems it's an issue. So it might work on Windows or on Linux and not the other way around. So the max HP says it's 4 GB. People have tested 8 GB. It's working fine with tiny core Linux. I just have 4 GB in there. Should be okay. Uh, let's take out the heatsink, see what the CPU and GPU situation looks like. So the heatsink, these things are usually numbered. So you have one, where's two? So one, two, three, four, five, six, and so that's how you're supposed to open that in a starish pattern. So one. All right, that is out, and that's how the heatsink looks at the bottom. The main CPU has one single heat pipe going through it, and the chipset just stays on this fat block of aluminum or magnesium. All right, so this is the chipset, and that's the VIA VX 900 silicon MSP3. So that has your GPU, your memory controller, and everything else. I'm guessing that has the memory controller. Yeah. And then you just have your VIA Eden, and that's the right way around for the CPU. VIA Eden X2U4200E, and that's your main CPU. And that's the dual core part, 64-bit, and as I said, thin, low power, and meant to compete with Intel Atom. So that's your CPU and GPU pairs, and CPU and chipset pairs. So right, so that's the mini PCIe slot I was talking about. That's your SATA slot. We saw that. Not much else beneath the heatsink. That's your parallel port, another peripheral driver, I guess. Um, I'm guessing that silicon image thing is the DVI port driver. So there's nothing much to it. It's very simple layout with all your power stages here, one power stage for memory over there, and not much else. Broadcom chip for networking, your RTC clock, couple USB ports here. That is your um, SPI for bootloader. All right, let's pack it back up, close it down, and take a look at it running Windows and see how it performs. And then we'll take a look at it running Linux and see how it performs. Now, that SSD is dead. Right, for whatever reason, this is the quality my very expensive Brio 4K camera is putting out. So, this is what you get. Um, that's the SSD. This is a Zebronics something or the other. It was extremely cheap on Amazon, and I bought it as an experiment to see how long these last. This is the last of them, and it just died. It had Windows 7 on it, installed on this HP T510. It's no longer working. Eh. Um, so the only loss here is I'll have to go set up Windows 10 again, play around with it, so that I can get some benchmark, some games on it, and show you the Chroma driver, because Windows is the only platform where that Chroma driver will actually work. Might actually get Windows XP running on it, probably Windows 7, because it's easier to install from a USB drive. And so let's take a look at the Linux for Onyx benchmarks on this platform. Let's take a look at the setup now that we removed the SSD. It should actually be quite quick. There you go. Yeah, the SSD was the issue. So this is the HP thin client BIOS setup utility, whatever. You have the asset tag, you have 4 gigs of RAM. So what people say is if you add 8 gigs of RAM, this only shows 2 gigs, but at 4 gigs, it shows 3.5 gigs, which is weird. Why is it showing more when 4 gigs is installed? I don't know. um, so there's no SSD on there. I'm just booting the Phoronix Linux image from my USB SSD. Um, quick power on, self test is disabled, so nothing special here. Nothing on the integrated audio peripherals and blah blah blah. There's just not much here, just very basic. You have your GPU memory share thing, um, power on after fail. So extremely basic. I've seen more from worse hardware, but this is all HP gives us. So let's exit and boot into Linux and see what the benchmarks look like. So yeah, so dual core, one thread per core, so just 2 cores, via Eden X2 U4200, and it's a x86 64-bit. Um, it doesn't have AVX obviously, but it has SSE, SSE2, SSE, SSE3. So it's not missing. Like I've had issues, and I'll show hardware with. I've shown hardware with via, I think it's C3 Nehemiah hardware before, where it's missing certain instructions from the x86 instruction set, but it has certain other ones, so it's very difficult to place it between i686, i586, or i386 or i486 class. So it's somewhere in middle, and some assumptions by the operating systems don't really work in terms of what CPU extensions are available. So CMOV is one of them that's usually missing, or PAE is missing, and we'll have some other ones. In this case, it's actually a pretty complete, from what I understand, implementation of the 64-bit and 64-bit and 32-bit x86 instruction set. So it's not like the older 32-bit only third-party implementations of x86, So this should pretty much run everything. Even has virtualization if that's something that's needed. Um, right. So again, GL Mark II, it's kind of irrelevant because the GPU drivers aren't there. So it's just CPU rendering, and it gets 13 FPS on average. It doesn't say anything about how well it can do 3D. Tiny Membench, it's pretty terrible. It's one of the slowest we've seen so far. Again, even though it's DDR3, doesn't matter if it's single channel, dual channel. If the internal memory control is just shit, then it's shit. Can't do much about it. Same with the other tiny bench result. Um, GMP bench is a bit better than some Intel Atom hardware, uh, like the one in the HP T505 or R3700. It's the same one. Um, just a, just double that performance, but it doesn't even compare to HP 5010 with the AMD G54 SoC. Um, yeah, even the RX0L with its single threaded performance outperforms the HP T510. X264 is kind of slightly better than the single core Sempron on the RX0L. Apart from that, nothing much. Dark table performance is actually better than Dell Vice 3040, which is surprising, but that's a memory limitation. That's not a CPU performance limitation. RX0L is slightly better with its single core. Um, oh, wait, seconds is faster. My bad, I'm reading that wrong. Um, so, yeah, it's not that good. it's I thought it was better than the Intel Atom ones, but no, it's actually much worse than the Intel Atom ones. Same with on the other dark table tests. Browser bench is something I'm interested in. Selenium. Um, it's at par with the RX0L, which I'm surprised. Um, so otherwise, it's kind of average on the lower end. So, so again, the performance is not something to write home about. It was for its time an Intel Atom competitor. Right, now have to go ahead, reinstall Windows 7 and try that out. All right, so I have gone through the process of installing Windows 7 on this hardware, and I've installed some games. I've installed a graphics driver, which was quite the workout in it of itself. And so we'll see how this performs. So as you can see, it's running fine in 1080p. Of course, none of the games are going to run at that high of a resolution. Um, the internal speakers are working, but probably not audible. So I'll bring another mic into the mix. So I have Fraps installed, I have Crysis, I have CPU Z, I have GTA, and I have The Simpsons. Uh, no particular reason for those games apart from the fact that this is in direct comparison to what we had on the Asus Revo 3700, and it ended up being a good mix of things to try out. But before we move to any game, let's take a look at CPU Z and what it shows. So shows that as Eden X2 U4200 as we expected. Core speed is 1 gigahertz. That's always been the case. And then based on 40 nanometer and then all the instruction set extensions. So nothing out of the ordinary. Just a 9-watt CPU, as I've said, it's in that Intel Atom range. You have the memory specs here and other info. Graphics is via Chrome HD9, and it was a big problem like installing the driver. I had to find the specific driver, get the correct one installed, and then had to do it through device manager instead of doing it like through the installer, because that never worked. But anyways, let's take a look at the first game, which is The Simpsons. Right, so it's running at 640 by 480 at the lowest color. But what you will notice when comparing, at least I do, when comparing to the Revo with NVIDIA Ion, is it's not skipping frames. It's not stuttering. It's fairly smooth, even though it's just 30 FPS. It's still very smooth compared to the Acer Revo, because even though that NVIDIA Ion would sometimes push more than 60 frames, it jumps to 70, or at least stays above 30. It did stutter a lot, and because it was continuously loading things, the CPU wasn't fast enough to fill up the video memory, and all of that issues kept on happening. Whereas in this case, it's actually not that bad. It's playable. Of course, graphics look terrible because it's running at such a low resolution. So if I go ahead and change that to anything higher, um, the performance would drop considerably, but it's still not stuttery. Like, this is fairly playable, even though it's like running at cinematic FPS. There are certain scenes where it seems to be rendering much better at a higher frame rate. There you go. That was one stutter. That was the first stutter I've seen. So the CPU is more than capable of running some games. I won't say all, but it's not as bad as the Acer one. The Intel Atom D525, if I remember correctly, that was dual core hyper-threaded, but that was higher clocked, but still more worse than much worse than this. Right, moving. Let's move on to GTA. Right, so the performance is much worse than Simpsons. Of course, is a much more demanding game. Um, But again, compared to the Revo, that's the only other device we've played any games on. Um, this is a lot more smoother. Even playing at 15 FPS, this is much more smoother than the Revo. So I'll just bump up the resolution again because I don't remember. I think it was at 800 by something. 640 by 480. Let's bump it to this one, 1024 by 768. And the FPS drops quite, not by much. So I thought it dropped, but it has picked back up, still at 15. But again, it does not stutter. It looks like it's running at 15 FPS, so it's not, you know, playable, or it's barely playable if you're passing your time. But so win for VIA. They made good cores with the Eden. Let's take a look at Crisis. Right, so we are down to single digit FPS on Crisis. It barely runs, but it's double digit. But it is what it is. It's working, but it's not complaining. Um, it's not playable by any means. It's quite crappy and very laggy, but again, not stuttering. So it's purely a GPU bound limitation here. Let's see if I can. I think all the settings are at low. What if I bump up the resolution a little bit? Didn't do much good. We are down to 6 FPS. So again, the GPU was really meant for HTPC and basic browsing, web browsing or media playback kind of thing. So it's not really meant for anything else. The only reason I am sitting here playing games or showing anything like that is because it's one of those GPUs that never got a Linux driver. You can't do 3D on Linux on it. It barely displays your. It just used as a HDMI output just because VESA standard exists in the BIOS and it just uses those calls instead of turning on the GPU at all. So that's about it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Subscribe for more, and I will see you all in the next one.